Hi, welcome to Gospel with Greg, and in this fifth video in the Historical Thinking series, I'm going to be talking about the idea of scholarly consensus. So by scholarly consensus, I mean kind of an idea or maybe a theory that is held by a majority of scholars, or maybe is the idea that the most scholars agree with. And this video is going to address the idea that some will lodge at Christians, which is that Christians should accept secular ideas because a majority of scholars believe them. So this might pertain to things like, Christians need to accept evolution because most biologists believe it, things like that. It can also apply to history as well. Maybe there's a certain secular-based idea of history that's applied to Christianity, and skeptics might say to Christians, you need to basically abandon your understanding of your faith and accept this secular idea of it because that's what more scholars advocate for. So we're going to address how do you deal with that, this kind of idea of, if a majority of scholars kind of agree with something that is kind of anti-Christian. And so what gave me this idea in particular, I want to acknowledge this, is I had a discussion with, I've mentioned Abdu Murray on my channel before. He did these videos a while back where he would take questions from a live chat and everything, and so I would participate in those, and so I submitted something to him that kind of was along the lines of this, and so he discussed a little bit of that in a couple videos. And so I'll put links to those in the description. He kind of talked about this idea, and I actually got to meet him around that time, and he and I had a good conversation about this, and so that kind of showed me the importance of this, and got some good takeaways from that. But the learning objective for this video is identifying the role of scholarly consensus, so kind of the bounds of it, things like that. And so again, Christians might feel intimidated when an expert pushes an anti-Christian idea, and might feel like that they don't have the right to tell them they're wrong. So a Christian might feel intimidated sometimes of, do I really have the right to tell an expert in biology they're wrong about evolution, or to tell an expert in history their understanding about Christianity is incorrect, and mine is. So some people might have that feeling, do I really have the right to disagree with someone who's far more educated than me in a certain area? So we'll talk about that. And so the biggest thing I want to stress in this video is that methodology and evidence is most important. Having a doctorate or 10 people that agree with you doesn't automatically make you and your idea correct. And so showing evidence and having good methodology is important. And the Bible backs this up as well. Firstly, in Matthew chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. And this is Jesus speaking. Enter ye in at the strait gate, for wide is the gate, and broad is the way that leadeth to destruction. And many there be which go in there at, because strait is the gate, and narrow is the way which leadeth unto life, and few there be that find it. So these verses speak to the fact that most people can be wrong. It's possible for the majority to be wrong. And then when we flip over to Proverbs chapter 12:15, we see the way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but he that hearkeneth unto counsel is wise. So this tells us that we can be wrong and think we're right. So when we put these two scriptures together, we can see that a majority of people can be wrong and think they're right. And we can see that in history, by the way. So an example is geocentrism, the idea that the sun revolves around the earth and not the other way around. And so when we look back at particularly the history of science, we see examples like that where there were commonly held beliefs about science by society that were later proven false. You know, the first scientists to challenge these false ideas were in the minority, but when we look back, we say that they were right because they had the better methodology and the better evidence. So we don't look back and say that, oh, well, I guess the idea that came before was right, because, I mean, look at all these different people that were in a consensus that said it was right. No, we look at who had the better evidence, who had the better methodology, and we today are willing to look back at, say, people during the scientific revolution and say, while yes, they may have been in the minority sometimes, they were right, because when we look at their evidence and methodology, we see that it's compelling enough to prove this minority position at the time. And so if a scholar uses bad methodology, it should be questioned and maybe even rejected, even by non-scholars. And so an example of that is for a PhD class that I took. There was a certain book. It was about around World War I, around that era. That's when the author wrote about that period of time. And one of my classmates and I both read that book. And so the methodology and the focus of the book was, it was meant to be the kind of condition and history of a certain area, told from the perspective of common people. So this scholar wanted to describe, you know, here is this certain country around World War I. Here was the state of it from the perspective of common people. That's kind of what they wanted to write about. But when I was reading this book and I was looking through the bibliography at the end, I noticed that there was very few primary sources from, you know, people like diaries or journals, things like that. So the kinds of sources that you would think would be the most helpful to go along with that methodology weren't there. And my classmate noticed that as well. We kind of had a discussion about this, and it's like, you know, given what the author said they wanted to focus on, it doesn't look like the research and the sources they used were the most optimal for that. Now, I don't know what sources this scholar had available to them. Maybe there just weren't a lot of primary sources that went along with what they were doing. You know, you can't wave a wand and just make 1,000 sources disappear. You're going to have to work with what's available. But again, like we talked about in the first video in this series, is that you might start off with research questions or a thesis in mind, but you kind of have to go where the evidence leads, and that kind of determines methodology as well. So, you know, regardless of whether the sources were there and they just weren't consulted, or the sources weren't there, the point remains that for this particular work, the methodology just wasn't good. The kind of research that and sources that were consulted just weren't good for the, or weren't optimal, I'll say it that way. It's a little less harsh. Wasn't optimal for what the author wanted to focus on. And so, in that situation, it's kind of like you either use, if there are the sources available, you either go find them and use them, or if there aren't the sources available, you really need to at least try to pivot what your research focus is a little bit to something where you can back it up with sources. And so we should also think about why so many people agree with an idea. If a history professor, for example, draws a false conclusion, even unintentionally, and teaches that to their class of 30 students, and all the students just believe it, and they go on to be historians themselves, as we can see here. 30 out of the 31 people that believe this model haven't actually looked at it. And so one thing I want to stress with this is I did underline this situation of, if the professor presents the false idea and that's all they do, they just say the conclusion and they don't show the evidence, and the students say, oh, well, Professor so-and-so is a scholar, so they must be right. Assuming that's the situation, you have a situation where the vast majority of the people in the group that believe it haven't actually analyzed it themselves. And so sometimes you can potentially run into that as an issue of, if a majority of scholars or a certain number of scholars agree to a certain idea, I think it's a fair question to ask, have all of them actually, looked at the evidence or, analyzed it to any extent, or did just a few people draw the conclusion and everybody else just trusted them? Now, of course, I'm not saying that every scholar has to reinvent the wheel and rediscover everything all over again. But again, if we get into just blindly trusting, just not looking into it at all, you can have situations like that. And of course, I'm talking about a specific scenario here again. I'm not saying that, all professors kind of just make blanket statements and expect students to blindly trust them. I have taught at the college level myself for a few years, so not bashing professors at all. But again, sometimes you can have a situation like that, kind of if something is presented that way, where, maybe a scholar is just kind of just states something as a fact, and people kind of just trust it because, oh, well, they're a scholar. You can have situations like that where, maybe a ton of people do believe a certain idea, but the number of people who've actually tried to analyze it is a small fraction of people in the group. And so sometimes, I'll admit, sometimes even Christians can fall into it too. Sometimes people can, end up just being Christians or, just believing Christian beliefs just because, maybe their family members are Christians, so they kind of just go along with it. And, even the Bible tells us that we each individually need to have our own relationship with God, and not just, oh, well, Grandpa and Mom and Dad are Christians, so I guess I am too. So, again, us as Christians, we can fall into that, but we shouldn't do that either. And so something that I do want to stress as well is this all does not mean that we should just completely discredit scholars. Not at all. But we do need to recognize that people can be wrong for some of the reasons I've mentioned, and having good methodology is important, and not just relying on credentials of, oh, well, I have all these degrees, so anything I say must be true. We do need to have good methodology, and so that's quite important. And again, some people might say, like with this series in particular that I'm doing, some people might look at some of the other videos I've done and say, well, Greg, it seems like you're cherry picking here. In some videos you'll say a majority of scholars accept this certain fact about Jesus, and you give it as a fact, but then when they buck against something you believe, you say you can't trust scholarly consensus all the time. Well, again, I would say you can look at scholarly consensus again, but if it's backed up by good methodology. And so, for example, Gary Habermas, he's a scholar at Liberty University who's done a lot of research on historical evidence for Jesus. And so he has had some experience with kind of, I guess you could say, polling other scholars from a variety of backgrounds, not just Christian scholars, but secular scholars as well, on what do they accept as facts about Jesus. And, he finds that, the scholarly consensus, what most historians accept about Jesus, includes things like he died on the cross, and his followers genuinely believe they saw him risen, things like that. And you can pair that with a discussion I saw, and I'll link this as well, by Dr. Travis Campbell, another scholar, who he breaks down in several videos. Some videos kind of summarize it too, why certain scholars, or why scholars accept certain facts. So you can go into like a detailed explanation of the methodology, again, of most scholars don't just say, oh yeah, Jesus died on the cross, just because that sounds good, but there's certain methods in historical analysis that you can kind of go into and say, okay, most historians believe that Jesus died on the cross, and you don't have to just go by scholarly consensus on that. You can look at the methodology as well and say, okay, you have all these different sources that talk about the crucifixion, kind of multiple attestation of it, despite the fact that it's ancient history and there tends to not be a lot of sources. You have certain things like, details they wouldn't make up, like, the followers of Jesus having to admit that he was killed by his enemies. That's something that people wouldn't be too keen to make up, especially in ancient history, where you have this idea of, if we beat you, that means our gods beat your gods. So you can kind of go into an in-depth methodology on some of these things. But then kind of going back to Dr. Habermas's findings, he shows these different facts that about Jesus, again, like the crucifixion and other things, that most scholars would agree with. But when he looks at why they reject the resurrection of Jesus, because maybe a majority of scholars do accept several facts about Jesus, but most of them might reject the idea that he was divine and resurrected. When you look at that part of the consensus, he's shown that you tend to not have as strong of a consensus on what an alternative would be. So a majority of scholars, again, will say things like, Jesus died on the cross, things like that. But when it gets to what's your theory on what happened if he didn't raise from the dead? Because again, another fact is that there were people that genuinely believe they saw him risen. Dr. Habermas finds certain responses like, he said he's heard some people say they just don't want to believe, which of course is not good methodology. Or other people that just kind of make this sweeping kind of miracles don't happen. And so again, you can look at scholarly consensus. It's not a completely useless thing. It's not one of those things where it's like, okay, it's either infallible or you can never use it. It's one of those things where scholarly consensus can be useful if there's good methodology that you can look at. Like if you can independently kind of investigate it through the methodology and say, yeah, that checks out with what they're saying. But if there is a part of the consensus where it's kind of just this hand waving of, don't know, we reject this just because, maybe this certain, don't want to believe, or like Dr. Habermas has heard, or if it's just all over the board of, because there's numerous different theories people will put forward about, what the best explanation is of what happened to Jesus as opposed to the resurrection. So there's not as strong of a consensus on an alternative theory as there is as strong of a consensus on something like Jesus died on the cross. So that's important to keep in mind when it comes to that, is, essentially what is the consensus backed up by, and kind of can you independently verify it if you look at the methodology and the evidence that's put forward for that particular idea. So hope this video was informative and that you enjoyed it, and hope you join me for the next video in the series. And until next time, God bless.